In this video, we are going to be talking about how to use wet sanding in order to repair car scratches, and also how to assess car scratches to figure out the steps that you actually need to take in the first place to fix them. Now, let's get straight into it. What's going on? So glad you guys are here, and welcome back to the Wilson Auto Detailing community. If you're a professional auto detailer who wants to become more successful and profitable in your business, or just a car enthusiast who wants to improve your detailing ability, then definitely consider hitting that big red subscribe button right below this video. So right now I am working on a Hyundai Elantra, and you guys can see the issue here, and I'm actually going to show you guys the entire panel because this scratch right here actually goes, this is the driver's side, it goes all the way down to the end of the car. So this is now the back driver's side, and then it actually even goes a little bit into this panel right here, this back fender. So this is a very, very serious kind of situation. Now, one of the reasons why this situation is unique is because this is not just a scratch at this point. This is a lot of transfer. For those of you who don't understand what transfer is, it is literally just like material or paint in a lot of cases that gets rubbed off onto the car that has the scratch from whatever the car rubbed against. And so all of this white part right here, this has not gotten down into the metal or into the body of the car. This is just white paint that has come from what she rubbed against. So let's go ahead and break all of this down, and let me share with you guys the steps I'm going to take in order to fix this. So first of all, just so you guys know, this is going to be a little bit longer form content video because there's a lot to talk about in this situation. So this is going to be a longer video, so bear with me. But here is the first step I'm going to take. So the first thing I'm going to have to do with this scratch is assess how much of this transfer is going to come off before I actually start wet sanding, because yes, I could wet sand this and it would take the transfer off, but the issue is if I can remove the transfer first, then I can assess how deep and how serious the scratch itself actually is. And so I'm going to get a better idea of all of that removing this transfer. So the first tool I'm going to use is the Mr. Clean Magic Eraser and my Meguiar's All-Purpose Cleaner diluted 10-to-1. You could use degreaser as well, diluted 5-to-1, 10-to-1, but this is just the first thing I grabbed for. Really, I'm just looking for a cleaner that can be used as a lubrication for this magic eraser. Now, as I use this magic eraser on this black paint, yes, it is going to abrade the paint to a certain level, but once again, I'm not too worried about how much it's abrading the paint because I am going to be wet sanding this and polishing it, and so the abrading that the magic eraser is going to do is it's just a non-issue right now. Now, sometimes it is important to understand that a magic eraser may or may not take this transfer off, and so this is something that, once again, I'm starting from like least aggressive method to most aggressive method, and so I might have to move to something like lacquer thinner if this does not work well. But once again, I'm trying to be least aggressive to most aggressive in order to see how well this is actually going to work. Yes, I'm putting a little bit more pressure than I normally would because I want to remove this paint transfer, and I'm not really worried about abrading the paint because I'm going to be wet sanding, polishing, and fixing all of that anyways. So what I can see here is that yes, the magic eraser is certainly helping to an extent, but it's not really doing as much as I would like it to do before I start actually the wet sanding process. And so I am going to, at this point, move to lacquer thinner. I do have a video of using lacquer thinner on the paint to remove overspray. If you've not seen that video, I'll hook it up in the YouTube card right now. Check that out. But I'm going to show you guys how I use the lacquer thinner at this point to actually attack something like this. Now, here is the thing with lacquer thinner, is lacquer thinner can be very dangerous if you do not know what you are doing. And so I always just caution people before using something like this. The main component of lacquer thinner is something called acetone. Acetone tends to not actually do anything to clear coat, which is good in our case because yes, acetone is going to take paint off, but acetone is not quite strong enough, at least in most situations, and of course with the right common sense, with the right amount of pressure, all that sort of stuff, it's not going to go through clear coat. And so I don't really have anything to worry about other than I'm just letting common sense lead me. I'm not scrubbing super hard. And once again, my only goal is to remove as much paint transfer as I can without having to wet sand or polish away. So see, what I saw here is that there was these two little scuffs right here of white paint, and that acetone literally took it right off, whereas the magic eraser did not do anything. And so all I'm gonna do is take my acetone, and I didn't use a ton. You know, I'm very, very conservative with chemicals like that because they're so strong. And I'm really just gonna take the acetone actually over every single scratch, because I don't really know 100% what is transfer and what is not transfer. And so I'm just trying to figure that out by using a little bit of pressure and using this acetone. Now I want to show you guys something that can happen when you use lacquer thinner, and just show you guys that it's not something you need to be freaked out about or scared of. But you guys can probably tell in the camera, yes, the paint transfer is now like gone. There's not really going to be any paint or paint transfer left in any of these scratches. And you can especially tell over here. It's difficult to even pick up on the scratch, honestly, but it is right here. Certainly you can see it right here, but the white that you saw now almost looks kind of yellow, if you guys can see, because I used this lacquer thinner with the yellow microfiber. The lacquer thinner actually kind of took the dye from the towel and put a little bit onto the paint itself, at the same time removing the white transfer. So this is not really transfer per se, as much as it is just kind of like a temporary issue. But once again, all of that is going to be fixed as soon as I start wet sanding. So let's go ahead and get into wet sanding now that all the transfer is gone. I have clayed the paint. I've used an IPA wash. Everything's totally prepared. Let's get into how I actually wet sand the paint. Okay, so in the camera you probably cannot pick up the scratch at a high level, but it's not going to kind of affect just the teaching of how to wet sand. So basically, here's going to be what I'm going to do. I have these little sanding blocks. Now these sanding blocks don't actually have any sandpaper on either side. You can buy sanding blocks with sandpaper on both sides, or with, you know, 1500, 2000, things like that. The reason you use a sanding block is because a sanding block disperses the pressure at an even, sort of like an even scale. So sometimes, yes, you could use just your hands, but once again, people argue that because you're just using your hands, you're dispersing the pressure deeper in certain spots, less deep in certain spots, because your fingers are not all pushing the same pressure. So if I were to wrap this sandpaper around this sanding block, then I'm dispersing the pressure evenly, and I'm not getting, you know, deeper valleys, less deep valleys, because I'm sanding off the clear coat. So with wet sanding, basically what I am doing is sanding down the surrounding clear coat of the scratch to the bottommost level of that scratch. So a scratch is just kind of a dip into the clear coat, basically at a really simple level. It's kind of like a valley in the clear coat. And so if you think of a mountain, and those mountains come all the way down, those mountains get eroded down to the bottommost part of the valley, well, then you just have a plain field, and you can no longer see that there was a valley there because everything's even. That is basically what is happening here. I'm sanding down the surrounding clear coat to the bottommost point of these scratches, and hence the scratches disappear, they're repaired, they're no longer there. But of course the drawback is you are sanding away clear coat, and the clear coat is what protects the underlying colored paint on the body of the car. And so it's kind of like wearing 50 SPF sunscreen and then going down to 25 SPF sunscreen. The paint, wherever it has been wet sanded away, is going to be more susceptible to things like weathering, the sun, fading, and all that sort of stuff. So I'm using 2000 grit sandpaper. So I'm going to wrap my sandpaper around my sanding block. And then what I have here for lubrication, or for the wet sanding part, is my Optimum No Rinse. I've got one cap full, and then I fill the rest up with distilled water. It works as a great lubricant. It's a great kind of just solution to use when you're wet sanding. Washes all of that wet sanded clear coat away, and it allows me to really see everything well, and it's got a lot of lubricants in it, which I like. So what I'm going to do is wet my sandpaper just like this with my Optimum No Rinse solution, and then I'm going to wet the area that I am wet sanding. Now what I want to do is wet sand across the gradient of the scratch, and what I mean is because these scratches are going horizontally, I'm going to wet sand vertically, okay, just like this. Now as I do this, I'm not going to speed any of this up because I want you guys to be able to kind of hear things and see things. I'm going to let the sandpaper do the work for me. So I'm not going to put a ton of pressure into this. I'm not putting a bunch of force I want the sandpaper itself to do the biting and to bite into the clear coat and to do basically the job of the sandpaper. Now, what you guys will find is because there's a little bit of a body line here, or what we call a character line, where the door kind of dips in because of the way she hit whatever she hit. And so this isn't like an intentional character line or an intentional body line, but the door kind of goes like this. There's a little bit of a dent right here. And so you need to be careful across things like character lines and dents because it gets more difficult to sand evenly, and you might see yourself actually sanding more here than you are here because once again, it's kind of like a valley. If you're holding something flat across it, the bottommost part of the valley is not really getting sanded, while the top of it right here is getting really sanded, and it might get away from you. And once again, there's only so much clear coat on the paint, and so if you actually sand away too much of the clear coat, then you are up a creek without a paddle, and you are going to be in a lot of trouble. So I'm just gonna keep sanding across the gradient of this scratch. Now, scratch removal as a rule, you know, in my world is a higher priced service because it does take some experience and some know-how in order to really get it right, if you ask me, and do it well. And it also takes a lot of time. And so not all jobs take the same amount of time, but I am very, very careful to take a lot of time when I'm doing things like scratch removal because it's such a tedious task, and if you get impatient with something like this, it's going to bite you in the butt because you are going to screw up. And once again, once you take away a certain amount of the clear coat, you cannot put it back on, okay? It's not like you're going to the barber and he cuts too much of your hair off and then it's just gonna grow back. Nothing is growing back here. And so this is a very more just time-consuming process. And so as I'm doing this, I would like to repeat, I am letting the sandpaper do the work. I am not putting a ton of pressure. And basically, here's what I'm looking for, is as I'm sanding with this 2000 grit sandpaper, I'm looking to see when these scratches are going to kind of go away. And so once I can no longer see these scratches with my naked eye, and I also like to use readers, like old people, basically readers, because it magnifies everything. And basically, if you can get these scratches perfectly or near perfect with readers on and with these magnifiers on, then when you take them off, then you're certainly going to be good with your naked eye. And so that's basically all I'm looking for, is when do I stop sanding? Well, I stop sanding when I can no longer see the scratch, or when I get uncomfortable because I've sanded so much already and I don't want to sand anymore for fear of taking a lot more of the clear coat off and either hurting my customer's car in the sense where it's so unprotected because there's such little clear coat on it that I don't think it's a good idea, or because there's just not much clear coat left and I have to, you know, I screw something up and I don't want to do that. One other thing you guys need to understand about clear coat is that clear coat is extremely thin, and I think a good way to think about it is like if you smoke cigars, or if you have ever opened like a pack of like sticky notes or something, there's that little cellophane wrapping that's on the outside of those sticky note packets. It's about as thick as those little sticky note packets, or like a cigar wrapper. And so there is not much clear coat to go through when you're doing something like this. Now, what I like about these sanding blocks is that they also work as a squeegee. This yellow side works as like a little, kind of like a squeegee. And so what I'll do, because it's difficult to see if the scratch is still there when it's so wet, I'll actually use this without a towel and just pull down, okay? And it pulls the water like a window squeegee does and dries it so I can see where I'm at with my wet sanding, and that way I don't have to get up and go get a towel, saves me time, and it's just a quick thing. And you can see, now I want you guys to see this. This is very cloudy, okay? As it dries more, you'll see it more. It's extremely cloudy and it's like white. Now, why is that? Well, because when you're sanding away the clear coat, that is what it looks like. This is what sanding marks look like. When you sand away clear coat, this is the finishing result, hence why you have to polish afterwards to polish out these sanding marks. So for those of you who are freaking out, this would freak you out if you've never done this before, but this is actually a good sign because it it means that what you're doing is working. You're sanding away the clear coat. So this is what you want it to look like. Now what I'm going to do is just continue exactly what I've been doing with the sanding block, the 2000 grit, the Optimum no rinse, and I'm just gonna wet sand the entire driver's side door, and then I'm gonna bring you guys in after I've wet sanded enough and show you guys before I polish, explain to you my thought process. So now I have done a fairly large amount of wet sanding. What you can see here is not only this clouding effect that happens when you wet sand, but you can also see that there are some spaces where the scratches are still coming through, like right here, right there, right there, right there. There's plenty of them. Now, why have I stopped right here with these scratches still being kind of apparent? Because number one, I've wet sanded a lot, and I'm a little freaked out to continue wet sanding, especially around these areas because I've done so much already. And secondly, because I'm going to be using my rotary polisher, and a lot of times what happens is even though these scratches come through a little bit, when they are hit with the polish after the surrounding clear coat has been wet sanded to a pretty high level like this has, then the polish will actually do the rest of the work, and these scratches will be so masked that they're not going to be seen against the black paint at all. Now, I'm not going to know that for sure until I actually start polishing, but once again, this is an area where I've got to think of my customer first and say, okay, even though I can still see these scratches at a certain level, the clear coat is so thin, I don't want to keep wet sanding right now. I want to see if I can go ahead and polish and mask them enough to where it's satisfactory and even beyond satisfactory in order to keep the highest level of protection I can all the way down this paint. So once again, I just want to show you guys what this looks like, and then I'm going to go ahead and take my rotary polisher and we'll go from there. So I am going to be using my rotary polisher with a wool pad. This is a 50-50 synthetic wool pad. I don't prefer the synthetic ones just because the fur the wool kind of slings everywhere and it's a little cumbersome, but this is just what I have with me. The wool pad is going to cut faster because it generates more heat quicker, and then I'm going to be using Meguiar's Mirror Glaze 105. Now, I'm just going to be using like light to medium pressure. This is not a video to demonstrate how to use a rotary polisher, but once again, I'm just using this rotary polisher because in this situation in particular, it's going to work much quicker, and it's going to work much better and give better results than the DA would at first glance. So what I'm going to do is put just a little bit of the Meguiar's 105 onto this pad. And if you've seen any of my other polishing videos, you know that I don't use a ton of polish just because it's really not necessary to use a ton. So I'm just going to use a little bit. A lot of times the manufacturers want you to use more because obviously they want you to buy more of their polishes. So here's about how much I'm going to be using, just a little bit of a spiral from the middle to the outside. Now what I'm going to do is go ahead and throw the cord over my shoulder. I'm going to spread it around just a little bit onto the paint so that I don't sling a ton. Now some of you guys have noticed that I have not taped off this edge. The reason I did not tape that off is because I'm only polishing this side. Yes, I'm going to get some sling inside of those crevices, but because the scratch is so close to that crack and it kind of goes over that crack, if I tape it off, I'm not going to get the scratch to the full degree that it needs to be polished. And so I would rather just not tape it off and go ahead and do some cleanup afterwards than put the tape over it and have to work with the tape and keep moving it and move it again in order to get 100% of the scratch. I find that cleaning it up afterwards is just going to be a lot quicker and easier and just more effective for me. So I started polishing and I stopped fairly quickly because as I'm polishing, yes, some of it looks really good in the camera, but you can see here, let's see if I can pick it up, there are still a lot of scratches right there, right there, right there, and so all of these scratches are still super kind of present, and so what that tells me is that this is either going to have to be wet sanded more or it's going to be permanent. And so what I'm going to do now, and the reason why I polished just a second ago even though there was still some pretty obvious scratching, is because I want to see what the final result looks like with minimal wet sanding because it leaves the maximum layer of protection on the paint, and that is what is in the best interest of the customer. And so what I'm going to go ahead and do is get my 2000 grit again, and I'm going to address these specific scratches. Obviously a lot of this has been taken away. Now that's just some polish that's left over, but a lot of this has been taken away. So I'm just going to go and hit these specific areas all down the paint, and then we're going to follow up with polishing again, but I'm going to bring you guys in after I've hit these specific scratches again. And once again, I'm doing minimal to, you know, least aggressive to most aggressive. So I'm going to be a little aggressive, a little bit more aggressive, and then the most aggressive. And then after that, if scratches are still present, then that's just going to be permanent, where they would have to be repainted or refinished at that point, and that's going to require body shop time and all that sort of stuff. So I went ahead and polished everything and actually finished it and waxed it because I want to show you guys kind of the finished result for a good reason, because basically what has happened, I'm going to show you guys kind of what's left over, and it's going to be difficult to pick up in the camera because cameras can be kind of flattering, but in person you can certainly see it. Right here, there's still a little bit of a cluster of some scratches. Right here, there's a little hairline scratch, and what actually happened is right here where the cluster of scratches were, this panel has been dented in and at the same time raised up, and so it's kind of been pushed in and raised up in different places. So kind of like this character line is raised up, but that's intentional. That's part of the uniqueness of the car. That has happened down here because of scraping against something. It's actually kind of raised the paint, and that will happen sometimes when people get into car wrecks or they get little scratches like this. So let me go ahead and show you guys all the stuff that's still here. Right there, we've got a little bit of a scratch. Let's see here. Right here where the two doors meet, you've got some places right here because once again, this is a part where the paint has been raised up, okay? So that's left over. And then we've got a few scratches right here that you may or may not be able to see that are a little bit more shallow, but they are still kind of visible nonetheless. But the main thing I want to communicate here is that when you stand back here, obviously it looks dramatically better, and you really cannot see it. Even in person, you can't really see it. But here's what I kind of want to explain to you guys, is that with scratch repair like this, and this is kind of the assessment part of the video that I was talking about, that you have to assess what you're going to be able to do, and there's times when you get into it and you realize that you're not going to be able to do, or you are going to be able to do something that you thought you weren't or you thought you were. And so what I always communicate with my customers is I'm never really going to know 100% of what I'm going to be able to fix until I'm actually doing it. And so one of the drawbacks with this situation in particular is the fact that the paint has been dented in as well as raised up with these scratches because she had hit whatever it was so hard and with so much force and kind of dragged it so much that it has dented it in. And so what happens is some of these scratches that are left over are actually sitting on those kind of raised lines, and at the same time those scratches are much deeper than any of the other scratches that came out. And so there's this like push and pull of you have to sand, but because these scratches are sitting on top of these raised lines, you have to be extremely careful about how much you're sanding, because the friction that's produced when the scratches are sitting on top of a line like that is so intense that it's very easy to burn through the clear coat and sand through the clear coat. And so once again, the scratches that did not come out, the reason they did not come out is because number one, they're extremely deep, and number two, they're sitting on top of these character lines that were produced through actually scraping up against whatever it was, and so you can only sand to a certain point. But this is a perfect example of proper communication, and number two, the job of a detailer, because I am kind of like the middleman between the body shop and the customer themselves, so that this is like a happy medium where are all the scratches completely 100% perfected? Well, no, they're not. But is it possible to perfect them all with just wet sanding and kind of in the scope of a detailer's practice? Well, no, it's not possible. This would take a spray gun, it would take a dent, remover and things like that. So it would take some body shop time to actually perfect this. And so once again, my job here is to communicate that if nothing else, I can dramatically camouflage these scratches to the point where the customer is going to be satisfied, because though they're not 100% removed, they're removed enough to the point where they're so camouflaged their customer's never going to see it, nobody else is ever going to see it, and it's not going to bother them. So I just wanted to give you guys one more kind of full length look at this so you guys can see what the average person is going to see. all the way going down. You cannot see any of these scratches. Even when you get up close, it looks so good. Once again, they're so camouflaged, it's just a non-issue. Now, for those of you wondering what I used 1500 grit sandpaper, I used 2000 grit sandpaper. I polished those sanding marks away with my DeWalt rotary buffer, and then I kind of fixed anything else that might have been wrong and kind of restored the glossiness and the luster with my Griot's Garage 6-inch dual action random orbital polisher with a microfiber and foam pad attached, as well as the polishes that I used were Showcar Power Bright and Showcar Renew It. Now, I'm gonna hook all of these things up in the YouTube description below this video. If you want to check out any of the products or the tools that I use to accomplish this job, check out the Amazon links below this video. And if you want to purchase any of those tools, definitely use my Amazon links in the description box below, because if you do use my links, it does give this channel a small commission, but it helps this channel stay alive so I can continue to give out awesome content. If you like this video, make sure to hit the thumbs up button, and if you have any questions, comments, concerns, hook up all that stuff in the YouTube comments below, because I always read those and I'm sure to get back to you guys as fast as I can. And once again, this was not really me hitting on polishing and polishers and buffers as much as this is about wet sanding, how to, and kind of the process and the thought process you need to have when you're dealing with scratches and wet sanding them. And lastly, if you're new here, then definitely consider subscribing, because I come out with videos all the time just like this on products, tools, strategies, communication skills, business skills, and so much more, all in an effort to help the pro detailers become more successful and profitable in their businesses. And on this channel, I share the same strategies that turned my business into a full-time income with part-time hours. So if you're interested in that, definitely consider subscribing. Once again, thank you guys so much for being involved here, and as always, from Luke here at Wilson Auto Detailing, keep working hard, and I will see you guys in the next video.